"Ma'am, you don't belong in this courtroom." The words landed sharp and certain, echoing across the polished wood and marble like a verdict already decided, and every head turned just long enough to see Ava Williams standing there in a plain gray blazer, wrists held still at her sides, her presence quiet, but somehow heavier than the room itself, fluorescent lights humming above, the American flag barely stirring in the conditioned air, and somewhere in the back a pin dropped, the small sound snapping attention back to her, as if the room itself didn't quite know what to do with her. A black woman standing alone in a space that had already judged her before she spoke, before she even took a breath. And Officer Daniel Hayes stepped forward, his shoes tapping hard against the floor with the confidence of someone who had never once been questioned in a place like this, his badge catching the overhead light, his expression tight with impatience, like he'd seen 100 people just like her and already decided how this would end. "You were told to wait outside," he said, voice low but carrying, the kind that didn't need to be loud to command obedience, and a few people in the gallery shifted in their seats, whispering just enough to be heard but not enough to be called out, and Ava didn't move, not an inch, her eyes steady, scanning the room not with fear but with something else, something deliberate, like she was measuring distances, noting details, absorbing everything from the position of the clerk's desk to the slight crack in the wood of the bench. And for a moment it felt like time slowed, like the air itself thickened, pressing against every chest in the room. "I said wait outside," Hayes repeated, stepping closer now, close enough that the scent of his cologne mixed with the sterile chill of the courtroom air, and still Ava didn't step back, didn't raise her voice, didn't plead. She simply tilted her head the slightest bit, her voice calm, controlled, almost quiet enough to miss if the room hadn't gone so still. "You're interrupting a scheduled proceeding," she said, and the words didn't sound like a defense. They sounded like a statement, precise, measured, out of place in a moment where everyone expected something else, something smaller, and a faint ripple of laughter moved through the gallery, quick, dismissive, like the room correcting itself, like people reminding each other where she stood and where she didn't, and Hayes let out a short breath through his nose, shaking his head, the kind of reaction reserved for someone who thought they'd already won. "You don't get to tell anyone anything in here," he replied, and his hand gestured toward the door, firm, final, as if the conversation was already over. But Ava's gaze didn't break, not even for a second, and there was something in that stillness, something that didn't match the role they had already written for her, something that didn't bend, didn't shrink, didn't disappear, and the fluorescent lights flickered once, briefly, casting a sharp line of brightness across her face, illuminating the calm in her eyes. And for just a moment, too brief for anyone to name, the room felt uncertain, like it had missed something important, like the story wasn't unfolding the way it was supposed to. And somewhere near the clerk's desk, a folder slid slightly out of place, unnoticed by most, but not by Ava, whose eyes flicked toward it for less than a heartbeat before returning to Hayes, steady, unwavering, as if she already knew exactly how this moment would end, even if no one else in that courtroom did. The silence did not break. It stretched, thin and fragile, as if the entire courtroom was balancing on something no one could see, and Ava Williams stood at the center of it without shifting her weight, her shoulders relaxed, her breathing even, like she had done this before, like this was not unfamiliar territory, and that alone made people uncomfortable in ways they could not explain, because nothing about her matched what they expected from someone being told to leave, and Officer Hayes noticed it too, the way she did not fidget, did not look around for help, did not lower her gaze, and it irritated him more than defiance ever could, because it felt controlled, intentional, and he stepped closer again, lowering his voice as if proximity alone would force compliance. "Last warning," he said, each word clipped, precise, and still she did not move, her eyes drifting past him for just a fraction of a second toward the elevated bench at the front of the room, the large leather chair sitting empty, waiting, untouched, and then back to him, steady as before, and something about that glance lingered in the air longer than it should have, like a detail that did not fit but refused to disappear. And a man in the second row leaned toward his neighbor, whispering something under his breath, a quiet chuckle following, quickly stifled, while the clerk behind the desk shuffled papers with unnecessary urgency. the soft rustle filling the growing tension, and Ava finally spoke again, her tone unchanged, calm, almost clinical. "The docket is set for 10 o'clock, she said, and a few heads turned instinctively toward the wall clock, its second hand ticking louder now, marking each passing moment with quiet insistence. 9:58, 9:59, the sound suddenly impossible to ignore, and Hayes let out a short laugh, shaking his head like he was dealing with a stubborn child. "You think you know how this works," he replied. But there was a slight delay before the words came, a fraction of hesitation that had not been there before, and Ava did not respond right away. She simply held his gaze, then glanced once more toward the clerk's desk, where the folder had shifted further, its edge revealing a name typed in bold across the tab, partially obscured but still visible enough for her to recognize. And when she looked back, there was the faintest change in her expression, not emotion, not satisfaction, just certainty settling into place. And somewhere near the back, a door creaked softly as someone stepped in and paused, taking in the scene, the stillness, the imbalance of it all, and the air seemed to tighten again, like a held breath waiting to be released. And Ava spoke one more time, softer now, but somehow carrying farther than before. "You are about to make a procedural mistake," she said, and this time the words did not draw laughter. They landed differently, heavier, as if the room itself recognized something shifting beneath the surface, even if no one had the language for it yet. And Hayes frowned, just slightly, his eyes narrowing as he studied her more closely, not as a distraction anymore, not as a problem to remove, but as something he might have underestimated. And the clock clicked forward, 10 o'clock exactly, the sound sharp, definitive, echoing through the courtroom as if signaling the start of something none of them were prepared for. The clock stopped matching the moment it struck 10, not because time had frozen, but because every person in that courtroom suddenly felt it shift, subtle and undeniable, like the ground beneath them had tilted just a fraction. And Ava Williams did not rush to fill the silence. She let it sit, let it stretch, her posture unchanged, her gaze steady, while Officer Hayes straightened slightly, as if recalibrating. His confidence still there, but no longer effortless, no longer automatic, and he glanced toward the empty bench for the first time. Just a flicker, just enough to register that something was not aligning the way it should, and the clerk behind the desk cleared his throat, a small sound that carried too far in the quiet, his hands hovering over the stack of documents like he was waiting for a cue that had not come. And Ava took a single step forward, not abrupt, not hesitant, measured, deliberate, the soft sound of her shoes against the floor echoing more than it should have. And a few people in the gallery shifted again, their earlier confidence dissolving into uncertainty, because now there was movement, and it did not match the script they had already written in their minds. And Hayes turned back to her quickly, stepping into her path, his voice firmer now, but edged with something new, something tighter. "That is far enough," he said. But the words did not carry the same weight they had just minutes ago. Not after the clock, not after the silence. And Ava stopped exactly where she was, not because she was told to, but because she had chosen the spot, her eyes lifting past him once more toward the bench, then returning. And for the first time, Hayes hesitated before speaking again, as if he needed to decide how to proceed, as if he was no longer entirely sure of the rules in this moment. And Ava's voice came, calm as before, but now there was a quiet authority threaded through it, something that did not ask to be recognized. It simply existed. "You should step aside," she said, and a faint murmur moved through the room, quickly suppressed, but not before it altered the atmosphere again. And Hayes let out a breath, almost a laugh, but it did not fully form, his eyes narrowing as he studied her more carefully, searching for something he had missed, some detail that would restore the balance he was used to. But instead he found only composure, only certainty, and it unsettled him in a way he could not immediately explain. And from the side door near the clerk's station, footsteps approached, quick, purposeful, the sound cutting through the tension like a signal. And the clerk turned sharply, relief and confusion crossing his face at the same time, while Ava did not look away from Hayes, not even as the footsteps drew closer, not even as the door opened wider, because whatever was about to happen, she had already anticipated it, and that realization hung in the air heavier than anything that had been said so far. The footsteps did not slow as they entered the room, sharp and urgent, cutting clean through the tension that had been building second by second, and every head turned now, not toward Ava, but toward the side door as a court clerk stepped in, slightly out of breath, a folder clutched tightly in his hand, as if it carried more weight than paper should, his eyes scanning the room quickly before locking onto the empty bench, then shifting, confused, uncertain, until they landed on Ava Williams, and something in his expression changed, subtle but immediate, recognition mixed with hesitation, like he had just realized he was already late. "We are ready to proceed," he said, his voice steady but carrying an edge of urgency. And for a moment no one responded, because the words did not land where people expected them to. They did not align with the scene in front of them, and Officer Hayes frowned, stepping slightly to the side, his body no longer fully blocking Ava, but not fully yielding. Either, caught between instinct and doubt. "Proceed with what?" he asked, his tone sharper now, seeking clarity, control, something to anchor the moment, and the clerk blinked once, as if surprised by the question, as if the answer should have been obvious, his gaze flicking again toward Ava, then back to Hayes. "The 10 o'clock hearing," he replied, and the words seemed to echo longer than they should have, stretching across the room and settling into the silence that followed, and Ava moved again, just one step forward, enough to close the small distance that remained, her motion smooth, unhurried, as if she had all the time in the world even though the clock had already declared otherwise, and Hayes instinctively shifted back half a step, not enough for anyone to call it retreat, but enough that it changed the space between them, enough that people noticed without fully understanding why, and Ava's eyes met his, calm, unwavering, and there was no challenge in them, no anger, just a quiet certainty that did not ask permission, and the clerk cleared his throat again, more carefully this time, holding the folder out slightly, not toward Hayes, but toward Ava, the gesture small but unmistakable, and a murmur rippled through the gallery before quickly being swallowed by the weight of the moment, and Hayes looked at the folder, then at the clerk, then back at Ava, the sequence repeating once as if his mind needed confirmation of what his eyes were already telling him, and something tightened in his jaw, not frustration now, not irritation, but realization beginning to take shape, slow and reluctant, and Ava did not reach for the folder yet. She let it hover there between them, a physical symbol of something shifting, something reordering itself in real time, and when she finally spoke, her voice was the same as before, calm, measured, but now it carried a clarity that filled the room without effort. "You should step aside," she said again, and this time there was no laughter, no whisper, no immediate response at all, just the faint hum of the lights above and the quiet, collective awareness that whatever was about to happen next would not follow the expectations that had brought them all into that room in the first place. The room held its breath as if even the air understood that something irreversible had just been set in motion, and Officer Hayes did not move right away, his hand hovering slightly at his side, his posture caught between command and hesitation, the kind that does not belong to a man used to control, and Ava Williams stood directly in front of him now, close enough that there was no longer a question of distance, only a question of choice, and the folder remained extended between them, the clerk's arm beginning to tremble ever so slightly under the weight of the moment, not the paper, but what it represented, and somewhere in the gallery a chair creaked softly as someone leaned forward, unable to look away, unable to fully understand what they were witnessing but certain it mattered, and Hayes finally spoke, though his voice had lost the sharp edge it carried before, replaced now by something more measured, more cautious. "You need to explain what is going on," he said, and it was the first time he had asked instead of ordered, the first time the balance had shifted in a way that could not be ignored, and Ava did not answer immediately. She let the question settle, let it echo in the quiet space between them, her eyes steady on his, not confrontational, not aggressive, simply present, and then she reached forward, slow and deliberate, and took the folder from the clerk's hand, her fingers brushing the edge of the paper with a familiarity that did not go unnoticed. And as she opened it, the soft sound of pages turning seemed louder than it should have been, each movement precise, controlled, like someone who had done this countless times before, and Hayes watched closely now, his gaze fixed, searching for something to confirm or deny what was unfolding, But the more he looked, the less certain he became, and Ava glanced down at the document briefly before closing it again, her grip firm, assured. And when she lifted her eyes back to him, there was no hesitation, no uncertainty, only clarity. "This proceeding has already begun," she said, her voice calm, carrying effortlessly across the room, and a ripple of confusion passed through the gallery, followed quickly by silence, because the statement did not match what they believed to be true, and yet it did not feel incorrect, and Hayes shook his head slightly, as if trying to reset the moment, to regain control of something that was slipping through his grasp. "There is no judge present," he replied, but even as he said it, his eyes flicked once more toward the empty bench. And this time the emptiness did not feel the same. It felt temporary, like something waiting to be claimed, and Ava followed that glance, just briefly, before returning her attention to him. And then she took another step forward, not past him yet, but close enough that the space between authority and assumption collapsed entirely, and her voice lowered just enough to draw him in, to make the moment feel contained, personal, undeniable. "Then you should not be standing in my way," she said, and the words did not rise, did not push. They settled, firm and unshakable, and Hayes did not respond right away, his jaw tightening as the realization that had been building finally began to take form, slow but certain, and the courtroom remained silent, suspended, every eye fixed on the two of them as the weight of what was about to happen pressed down on the room like a storm about to break. No one spoke after that, not because they had nothing to say, but because whatever words they had no longer felt sufficient, and the courtroom seemed to settle into a deeper kind of silence, one that was not empty but full, heavy with realization, and Ava Williams did not move forward immediately. She did not rush to claim the space in front of her. Instead, she stood exactly where she was, holding the folder close against her side, her breathing slow and even, as if she was allowing the room to catch up to what she had already understood. And Officer Hayes remained in place. But something in his stance had changed. The rigidity softened, the certainty loosened, his shoulders no longer squared with absolute authority, but angled slightly, uncertain, and his eyes stayed on Ava now, not dismissive, not superior, but searching, as if trying to reconstruct the last few minutes into something that made sense, something that aligned with the rules he had always known. And yet the more he tried, the more it slipped away, and across the room the clerk lowered his gaze, adjusting the papers on his desk with careful precision, as if restoring order to something small might balance what had just unraveled on a larger scale, and the faint hum of the overhead lights seemed louder now, filling the gaps where conversation should have been. And Ava finally shifted her weight, just slightly, her gaze lifting once more toward the bench, the empty chair no longer feeling distant, no longer symbolic, but present, waiting, and she took a step, not abrupt, not forceful, but inevitable, the kind of movement that did not ask permission because it did not need it. And Hayes watched her, his breath catching just enough to notice, his instincts pulling in two directions at once, one telling him to stop her, to reassert control, the other telling him that doing so would be a mistake he could not undo. And for a moment he stood there, suspended between those choices, and then slowly, almost imperceptibly, he stepped aside, not fully, not dramatically, but enough to clear the path, enough to acknowledge what he could no longer deny. And Ava walked past him, her pace steady, her posture unchanged, and as she moved toward the front of the room, every eye followed, not out of curiosity anymore, but out of recognition, the kind that settles quietly but firmly, and the distance between her and the bench closed one step at a time, the sound of her footsteps measured against the stillness, each one marking a shift that could not be reversed. And the air felt different now, not tense in the same way as before, but charged, like the moment just before something is revealed. And Ava reached the steps leading up to the bench and paused, just for a second, her hand brushing lightly against the edge of the polished wood, grounding herself in the space. And behind her, Hayes remained, where he stood, no longer at the center, no longer in control, watching as the situation redefined itself without him. And no one interrupted, no one moved to question it, because somewhere between the first word and this moment, the truth had already begun to surface, and all that remained was for it to be fully seen. The wood beneath Ava Williams's hand felt cool and solid, grounding in a way that nothing else in the room was anymore. And for a brief second she remained still at the base of the bench, not hesitating but allowing the final shift to settle into place. The kind of pause that marks the exact moment before truth becomes undeniable. And behind her the courtroom had gone completely silent. Not a whisper, not a movement. Just the faint hum of the lights and the distant echo of air moving through. Vents. And she stepped up, one measured step at a time. Her shoes brushing softly against the polished surface, the sound deliberate, controlled, each step carrying more weight than the last. And the elevated platform no longer seemed distant or reserved. It felt inevitable, like it had always been hers to reach. And as she moved, the perspective of the room changed. The rows of seats lowering beneath her line of sight, the angles shifting, the space reorganizing itself around her presence. And when she reached the chair, she did not rush to sit. She turned slowly, facing the room, her posture straight, her expression composed. And in that moment, every person present saw her differently, not as an interruption, not as a disruption, but as something they had failed to recognize from the very beginning. And the clerk, still standing near his desk, straightened instinctively, his uncertainty replaced by quiet readiness, while Officer Hayes remained near the center aisle, no longer blocking anything, his arms at his sides, his gaze fixed upward now, following her movement with attention that had nothing to do with control anymore and everything to do with realization. And Ava placed the folder gently on the bench, her fingers resting on it for a brief second before releasing. The small gesture carrying a sense of ownership that did not need to be announced. And then she reached for the gavel, her hand steady, familiar, as if the motion lived in her muscle memory rather than her mind. And a ripple moved through the gallery, not sound but awareness, the kind that passes from one person to another without words. And Hayes took a slow breath, his chest rising and falling as he finally understood the full shape of what had been unfolding. The missed cues, the dismissed words, the certainty he had mistaken for defiance. And Ava lowered herself into the chair with quiet precision, the leather creaking softly beneath her as she settled in, the final piece of the moment clicking into place. And when she lifted her eyes, they were no longer meeting Hayes at eye level. They were above, steady, authoritative, and the room felt smaller under that gaze, more defined, more accountable, and no one questioned it. Not because they could not, but because the answer had already revealed itself. And Ava spoke, her voice calm, clear, carrying effortlessly across the courtroom. Court is now in session. And the words did not echo. They settled, firm and absolute, leaving no space for doubt. And in that instant the roles that had governed the room just moments ago no longer existed, replaced entirely by a new reality that no one could ignore. The words settled into the room like a final note that refused to fade, and for a moment no one moved, not even to breathe too loudly, as if the courtroom itself needed to adjust to the new order that had just taken hold. And Ava Williams remained still in the chair, her posture composed, her hands resting lightly on the edge of the bench, not gripping, not tense, simply present, and her gaze moved across the room with quiet precision, taking in every face, every reaction, not with judgment but with awareness. And Officer Hayes stood where he had been left, no longer at the center of anything, his shoulders no longer squared, his stance no longer certain, and the weight of realization settled visibly into his expression, his jaw tightening before loosening again, as if the tension had nowhere left to go. And he took a small step forward, not in authority, not in command, but in uncertainty, the kind that comes when someone recognizes they have misread everything. And his voice, when it came, was lower than before, stripped of its earlier sharpness. "Your Honor," he began, the title unfamiliar on his tongue in this context, and the room seemed to register it all at once, a subtle shift passing through the gallery as people adjusted in their seats, their earlier assumptions dissolving into something quieter, more reflective. And Ava did not interrupt him. She allowed the moment to unfold, her eyes steady, her expression unchanged. And Hayes continued, choosing his words more carefully now. "I was not aware," he said, and then stopped, because the sentence did not feel complete, did not feel sufficient. And the silence that followed did not rush to fill itself. It lingered, giving weight to what he had not yet said. And Ava finally spoke, her voice calm, even, carrying without effort. "Awareness does not determine responsibility," she said, and the statement landed with a clarity that needed no explanation. And Hayes nodded once, slowly, absorbing the words, not resisting them, not deflecting. And the shift in him was visible now, not dramatic, not exaggerated, but real, the kind that happens internally before it ever shows outwardly. And he straightened slightly, not to reclaim authority but to meet the moment with what remained of his composure. "Then I apologize," he said, the words measured, deliberate, and the room seemed to hold on to them, not dismissing them, not amplifying them, simply acknowledging them for what they were. And Ava watched him for a brief second, her gaze steady, not soft, not harsh, simply present. And then she inclined her head just slightly, a gesture so small it could have been missed. But it was not, because in that room every movement now carried meaning. And she turned her attention forward, toward the proceedings, her hand moving to the documents in front of her, the motion smooth, practiced. And as she began to organize the papers, the courtroom followed her lead, the clerk sitting straighter, the gallery quieting further, the space aligning itself with her presence. And behind it all, Hayes stepped back, not forced, not instructed, but understanding now where he stood and where he did not. And the room, once filled with assumption, now settled into something else entirely, something steadier, something grounded, as the weight of what had just happened remained, not loud, not chaotic, but undeniable. The courtroom did not return to what it had been. It could not, because something fundamental had shifted beneath every polished surface and quiet expectation. And Ava Williams moved through the proceedings with calm precision, her voice steady, her instructions clear, each word carrying the quiet authority that no longer needed to be proven. And the room responded in kind, the clerk following her cadence, the attorneys adjusting their posture, the gallery sitting still, not out of obligation, but out of recognition. And even the air felt different, less tense, more defined, as if the space itself had settled into its proper shape. And Officer Hayes remained near the side now, no longer the center of attention, his presence reduced to observation rather than control. And he watched, not with resistance, not with disbelief, but with a kind of quiet reflection that had not been there before. His earlier certainty replaced by something heavier, something more thoughtful. And Ava did not look back at him, not because she ignored him, but because she did not need to. The moment between them already complete, already understood. And as the hearing progressed, her movements remained consistent, measured, each action deliberate, from the way she turned a page to the way she paused before speaking, allowing silence to do its work when needed. And the rhythm of the courtroom followed her lead, steady and grounded. And when the final matter was addressed, she closed the folder gently, the soft sound echoing just enough to signal completion. And for a brief moment she remained still, her hands resting on the bench, her gaze forward. And then she reached for the gavel, lifting it with the same controlled motion she had shown from the beginning, and brought it down once, the sound firm but not harsh, a single note that marked the end without excess. And the room responded not with noise but with stillness, a shared understanding settling over everyone present. And Ava rose from the chair with the same quiet composure, stepping down from the bench not as someone elevated, but as someone grounded in exactly where she stood. And as she moved toward the side exit, the space parted naturally, no one instructed, no one directed, just an unspoken acknowledgement of her presence. And Hayes watched her pass, his posture straight but no longer rigid, his eyes following her not with authority but with respect that had not existed before. And he did not speak, because there was nothing left to correct, nothing left to assert, only something to carry forward. And Ava continued without pause, her steps steady, her expression unchanged. And as the door closed softly behind her, the courtroom remained in silence just a moment longer, as if holding on to what had just occurred, before slowly returning to motion, not the same as before, but altered in a way that would not be undone. And the light from the high windows stretched across the empty bench, resting there quietly, as if marking the place where truth had been seen without needing to be spoken.